If you've been following throughout this entire process, you know that we kind of started with this 4-part project build, which has gotten us to this state. So let's go ahead and share that desktop. Part 1, there's a couple of things we did. We kind of basically just set up our whole entire project. We, in part 2, then went ahead and I believe, what did we do in part 2? I don't remember what we did in part 2, but in part 3 is when we actually connected it to the front end. Part 4 is where we actually did our OOJS refactor. We've since then added some more models to our application. And now we're kind of going, and then on the front end, we added Bootstrap, which is how we've gotten to this place. But now we're going to kind of go back to the back end and start thinking about and talking about JWT and implementing that in this project build that we've been working on over the last few weeks. And in order to do that, I have, as I always do, created kind of a README as a guide. So if you click on that link, that backend repo, you will find this JWT auth Rails markdown file, and we heavily rely on this JWT walkthrough that's already in the Learn curriculum. So I'm also going to share that, and then we'll go ahead and jump right in, because as I mentioned, y'all, we have a lot to cover. So if you haven't already, please review this walkthrough, because this walkthrough goes into much more detail than I'm going to be able to go into. And if y'all have seen, I've extended this another 30 minutes. So we have an hour and 30 minutes, but this walkthrough goes through way more than I would be able to get to in this session. So please do review that on your own time. But to get started, right, we're going to need a user model, which we didn't have before. And I often tell folks, right, do you need a user model to build your JavaScript project? No, you don't. No, you don't. But if your application kind of requires it, then go ahead and build out a user model. But in order to do that, right, you're going to need to build auth. In order to build auth, we're going to have to have some user functionality, have a user model. So I went ahead and built all that offline. You know, you first want to obviously make sure you have an API. And then we're going to go ahead, and this is, again, things I've done already. We're going to create our user migration, our model, our seed data, our validations, our serializer, our routes, and all of that stuff. And obviously, we're going to make sure that we have secure password, right? The crux of this, or the start of this, is leveraging that bcrypt gem, which may be familiar from our Rails days, right? If we go, where's our gem file? Cool. Here's our gem file. Bcrypt, when you first run your Rails API, is commented out. You want to make sure that you comment back in bcrypt, because this is the gem we're going to be using. That gem allows us to use something called the has secure password macro, which you should be familiar with. And then if we go into, and if you're not here in Rails yet, if you're kind of sneak peeking from Rails, don't worry. But also just don't get too bogged down with this stuff. And then where do we want to go next? We want to look at our schema next, right? Because what do I need on my schema in order to leverage bcrypt? What attribute do I need on my user model? I have secure password. I have the gem. There's this other third piece I need for this to all work in tandem. Yep, that's exactly right. As for Ashley, I need the password digest on my user table here, and that can be found here. And I've also had to add a foreign key on my syllabus table. All of that, all of the steps I took to actually get my user model up and running is kind of outlined in lines 1 through 2, just to give y'all an idea of how this is all built out so far. I skipped a lot. I'm going to skip a lot of this setup stuff because a lot of this was covered in previous project builds when we talked about the models and controllers and things of that nature. But before we get too deep into actually going into our user controller and look our create method that we built out here, does anyone have any questions about bcrypt yet? Just like the setup of bcrypt, because I'm kind of moving forward assuming that we're familiar with bcrypt from Rails. Cool. If you start building this out and you realize, you know, you still need to get a little bit more solid with bcrypt, then feel free to like kind of go back and refer to those labs. But the last and final thing we did is we built out a create method for our user. Again, this is also review, so not going to spend too much time here. But the main thing I want to call out is that, right, we have our validations in place. Validations, super important, especially when it comes to authentication, because, right, we're using email as our login attribute. So we need to make sure that is unique. I probably should also add in some presence true validations in here. But this line 6 is super important to authentication because I'm going to ask the user for their email when they log in, right? And if it turns out in my database I have duplicate emails for whatever reason, then that becomes a problem when I go to find my user for authentication. And we can talk about that a little bit more when we get there. But in my controller, my create method is also connected to my routes, which I've previously set up. So again, this is a lot of this initial stuff is review here. But I added my resources for user and I'm only looking at create right now. And in here, I'm checking to see if the user is valid, right? If the user is valid, I'm going to render a new instance of my serializer, pass in that user object, and then I'm going to give it the status of created and or not acceptable. And these right here, these symbols are just like built-in status code from Rails. Last note on this controller before we go ahead and test this creation in Postman is we need to remember that has secure password gives us a password attribute that we can use throughout our code. We do not want to reference password digest in our params or in our C data. I did this accidentally where I'm gonna toggle soft wrap here so y'all can see. Where in here I had password digest instead of password. It gave me a bcrypt invalid hash error, and I was trying to figure out why. I was playing around in my console, pulling my hair out, doing all this Stack Overflow digging, and totally forgot that in just like a blank kind of flushing out of C data, I totally put password digest here, and that was giving me errors. So we do not, and that is noted here, we do not need to use password digest attribute directly because the has secure password macro gives us these attributes or they become available to us. Cool. So we went over that create action method. We went over our routes. We went over why we use password and not password digest. Now we are going to make sure that we can actually create a user. We need to make sure that our user model is set up correctly, aka we can create a user before trying to move on to authenticating them in any way or adding on any sort of auth layer there. So in order to do that, we are going to use this super fun tool, and super fun and useful. You know, when things are fun and useful, that's just a plus. And it's called Postman, and this is what we're going to use to actually test our create here. So let me, yeah, this is fine. So in order to, for folks who are not familiar with Postman, I have a link here, but it's an app that allows us to do so much, especially if we're into APIs, and just like building databases out in general, and testing them. But in order to do that, I've downloaded the Postman app already. If you haven't, you can go ahead and start to download it. But this allows us to kind of save us some time, right? I don't need to build out a whole sign up form and functionality on my front end just to make sure I can create a user through a fetch call, which is what Postman allows us to do in this instance. So first thing I'm going to do is, and I can, if you're just opening up Postman and you're following along, I can start from scratch here. So I'm going to click that new button, right up at the top. New, I'm going to do new requests. And I can say like testing user creation. I can really name this anything. All of this stuff becomes,
yeah, we see the auth Rails screen. We don't see what you're doing.
Y'all don't, what do y'all see?
JWT auth Rails.
Oh my goodness, have I been sharing the wrong screen this entire time? Now do y'all see Postman?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I have been sharing the wrong screen the entire time. So this whole time when I was talking about the setup for the user model, y'all did not see that. Good to know. Oh no, her secrets are out. Yeah, so now y'all can see this screen. So y'all can see this is kind of what I've been going over, that, you know, we've built out our server, we've built out our user model, and we've built out our model using steps 1 through 7 here. We just went over this create method, which I don't think y'all could see. And now we're actually going ahead and set up the routes, and now we're going ahead and actually going to test. So now we're creating this new request, right? Just testing create user in Rails backend. Like this doesn't have to be super specific, but if you were like sharing this with a team, you're a part of a larger dev team, this would become super important. But for now, we're just testing here. Cool. So we've created a new request, and right, step 1's done. And then in the URL box, right, we're going to drop down and make sure we're making a post request to this endpoint, because this is the route for creating a new user. It's going to be a post method though, post request. And then we're going to put that URL in there. Other thing we want to do is update the headers with content type. We don't need to use this except, it's totally optional. But in order to do that, we're going to go to headers here. The key is going to be content type, and they kind of provide that for us. And it's going to be specifically application JSON. And again, accepts is not mandatory, but we can just put that in as well. All right. So then this third and final piece, now that we have our headers, right, we're kind of formatting this just like we would a fetch request on our front end. I'm also going to make sure I'm looking at the chat, because I want to make sure y'all can see what I'm trying to show you. Okay, so body. Here is where we want to actually build out the body for our request. This is what that body needs to look like. The thing that may look immediately different is that we are nesting user. Meg pointed this out in one of our last study groups. She had a question about strong params and how in the previous build, we were not requiring the top level object. And I think that is such a good call to actually make sure we're requiring that top level object, because it just makes our strong params even stronger. And this is how we generally want to be accepting params. So because I am requiring user, right, my body needs to actually look something like this. So instead of it just being name, email, password, image URL, it needs to be user, a user object with the nested attributes in there. So I'm gonna pull my Postman screen up again and make sure y'all can see it. So this is the way my body is gonna look, and it's going to be raw, and I'm going to make sure it's JSON. And because I have it here, I'm just going to copy that entire body here. So I don't have to watch me type it out. Sweet. So I have my user object, right? That's what my Sean Params is looking for. I have my name, giving it name, email, giving it the email, password, bio, all the stuff that my database needs. I'm gonna go ahead and press send here. This isn't gonna work because I need to run my server. Oh, right. Sweet. All right, so that should be up and running now. Let's try that again. Fail to create user. Why did you fail to create user? So I have done this before. My user, so if I were to go into, I see this rollback, and then I see user exists, right? And this is kind of giving me a hint that go into my Rails feed, my Rails console, I will see that I already have Sylvia in here, right? So remember that validation I had? This is actually really good. This means my validation kicked in, the user was invalid, and my error message showed up. So this error message failed to create user, not very specific, you know, but it failed at line 6 because of this validation here. So what I'm going to do is just change that email, just to kind of get through the test here. So in here, I'm just gonna do Sylvia. All right, now let's go ahead and rerun that. There we go. Successful JSON data that we get back. This is what my JSON data looks like. And this is also kind of why in the beginning, I did not do the strong params that required the user object, because you can see once we get in the front end, we're going to have to go through user, data, then attributes, then to get to all the way to get to name. And traversing nested objects can be complicated at first, but I feel like now that y'all are familiar and comfortable with it through this project build, this won't be a huge leap for us. Cool. So we have tested creating a new user in the front end. And now we can safely move to actually implementing JWT in our backend. And right, I'm only going to move to this step after I know I can successfully create a user from my front end or using a request call. I am going to read these messages. Okay. Okay, so y'all are just chatting. All right, is active record update via SQL transactions? I'm not sure what that question is asking, but active record uses SQL, right? SQL is happening in the back end, even as we're using a front end fetch request. I hope that's getting to your question there. But as you can see, right, as we're testing this in Postman, it is actually like writing SQL and kind of querying our database for us here. Anyone have any questions about the current setup of our controllers and our user model and our C data, all of this stuff before we actually get started in implementing JWT? I'm just realizing you guys probably didn't see my screen when I was going through how we got here. Inside of Postman, where the data and attributes and properties is specific to Postman or Rails. All right, so let's make sure I'm sharing that screen. All right, so Chris, Postman, where data?
In the body, down below where you have the object. Yep.
right in here.
Yep. It says user, and then underneath user it has data.
Yeah. So this is how my data is being serialized.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is going to also be the same in the front end as well. Postman is not going to like inject any of its ideas or the way it wants to format our JSON. It is literally going to return whatever gets returned from this call. In my case, I am rendering serialized JSON data. So that's exactly what I get back here, and it's exactly what's going to be returned in my JavaScript front end.
Cool, thank you.
Good question.
Just to clarify, is the data from Postman coming through as a params like normal, or is it some sort of special vector since we're using JWT?
No, so we're not using JWT yet. So this is as normal, totally like this is if we were to actually build out a JavaScript form, right? Or build out an HTML form in our JavaScript, and Sylvia was to actually give her name, her email, her password, all this stuff. And then I actually use those inputs and sent a post fetch request to my backend, I would get this JSON response in my fetch request. Because this lecture or this study group is about JWT, I didn't want to bore y'all with all that, but we will do all of that for the login. We'll go through the form and the JavaScript functions and all that, but we haven't yet implemented JWT, which is our next step here. Good question, y'all. Like, what is Postman doing, right? It's just a way for us to test the responses we get back to certain endpoints, like this one, for example, which we have outlined in our routes here, which is connected to this method. And this method returns our JSON data if the user is valid. Okay, I just want to make sure I'm continuing to share the correct screen. So now that we have confirmed, right, we are not moving to this step until we can confirm that we can create a user. We just did that. So now I think we're safe to move on to JWT here. In this walkthrough, I have notes as always about like why we're using the technologies we're using. But for the most part, we're using JWT, right, because it is stateless, right? We're not going to store any information about the logged in user. We don't need to store any information about them on the server. Instead, right, the client, whenever you hear the client, the browser store, in this case, whenever you hear the client in this case, the browser stores a token and sends that token along with the authenticated request. So because we're not handling all of our auth in one Rails application, right? Because we have a Rails API, separate repository, with a JavaScript front end, separate repository, we need a way to kind of like pass some information or a baton back and forth to let our application know that this user is who they say they are. They have access to this information that I want to show them. And this image kind of walks through the auth flow. So for whatever reason, this user's name is Bob. And then they first access the client app, our JavaScript front-end application, right? We ask the user for their credentials, this login form, which we also have here, our login form. We're gonna ask the user for their credentials. Then we send those credentials back to our front-end app. Those credentials get sent back. Our JavaScript handles that input to make a call, step 4, to our backend API. All right, and then we're going to make sure those credentials are correct. So this is kind of where we use that .authenticate method that you may be familiar with from Rails to confirm that those credentials are correct. If the credentials are valid, get sent back to our API, and then we send that JWT token back to the client. So this is like a very, very high level overview of this handshake, how this all kind of works. But what does it actually look like built out? And that's what we're going to go over. Again, an existing user makes a request. We're going to validate those credentials. We're going to give a token to that client, give a token to the browser, the front end application, and then we're going to store that token in our JavaScript code. But we first need to do a whole lot of code, not a whole lot, but some code before we can get to the token, right? We need to actually implement JWT here. And there's a couple ways we can do this. And y'all are going to hear me say this a lot. There's like so many ways we can implement JWT. There's so many ways we can implement authentication, right? But this is just one way we're going to do it. And we're going to put most of our JWT code in the application controller. Because the application controller is being inherited by our user controller and eventually our auth controller, we're just going to make sure that that top level parent controller has all of our functionality for JWT and eventually our helpers. And again, this walkthrough goes into way more detail about bcrypt and also about how we get all of this set up, right? What that example fetch request may look like to create a user. And then also what JWT even is, right? How it's separated into the 3 strings separated by periods. It goes to the gem and how you can play around with it in the console. But I figured y'all can read up on that. Y'all really just want to see how this works, right? So that's what we're going to be focusing on in this session. So we're going to start, as the walkthrough states, in our application controller. Where are we? Where is it? There it is. Cool. So currently it's empty. But the very, very first thing we want to do, which is kind of outlined in my step 1 here, is we're going to build out encoding the JWT token. This method takes 3 arguments. It takes a payload to actually encode. JWT is going to do this encoding. And our application's secret of developer's choice, and then an optional 3rd argument to specify the hashing algorithm. So we're not going to use that 3rd argument. This is the payload that our code's going to eventually pass through in our create method, and we'll in our auth controller, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this my secret is that 2nd argument. This is something we 100% want to put in an environment variable. We want to store this secret in our secret or our Rails credentials. But for now, for this walkthrough, the way it's defined here is totally fine. This is not like a deployed or super secret application. So I'm first going to create an encode token method, right? It is going to use JWT to encode that token or encode that payload using my secret. Right? It doesn't have to be whatever I put here. And again, right, this is, we're literally using this walkthrough. So a lot of more information is sent. Like in the Rails console, it shows you if your payload is beefsteak, right, you can do this and then you'll get this back, right? This is like the period separated JWT token that we are encoding, right? This is what happens when we run JWT, give it a payload and encode it. It returns this token. This is what a JWT token looks like. Excellent question, Anthony. What is H265? So I didn't know if we were going to be able to actually talk about encryption algorithms or cryptography in this session, but Looks like we are. So this
265
is,
is a video encoding format. I'm getting confused.
you said what?
H.265 is a video encoding format.
So this is one of the algorithms or one of the cryptography algorithms that JWT is using. We can see that a little bit more here. And then also we can see all of the different algorithms we can use in our application. There's a Python example here. There's Rails somewhere in here, probably at the bottom, which gives us, it's Ruby, same thing. Yeah, we can use all of these in our Ruby code. We're just using H6 or HS256 for this implementation of JWT. And it's what most folks are using. I'm not familiar with folks. I haven't really seen implementation of any of the other of these algorithm codes. And we can also do research into like, how are they different? But good question. This is essentially what JWT is using. This is the algorithm we're using to encode our token. And I can also drop this link in the chat so y'all actually can look up JWT and get some more information on it. So this is our first step here. We're going to encode the token, right? So we can get this back. This is the encoded token we're eventually going to be passing to JavaScript. But, right, we also want to eventually decode our token. And I'm also realizing that I may have skipped this important step of making sure you have JWT in your gem file. JWT is a gem. So, right, we want to make sure that that gem is actually in the gem file. So that's something I already have in there. So I can encode my token, right? And I'm also just going to.
Hey, Anna, you're passing in a typo. Sorry.
Yeah, please do. Oh, right here.
Yeah, no A.
Ah, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yeah, y'all, whenever y'all see that, just go ahead and speak up. I'm not going to be able to be looking at the chat as much as I would like to. Thank you so much, Connie. So yeah, that definitely would not have worked. So we've encoded our token, and we talk about why, and I can also, for folks who are bothered with comments, just bear with that. So now we're going to start working on actually decoding our token, right? So we're encoding it, but eventually we're also going to want to decode it to actually authorize the user on the front end to be able to do certain things. And in order to do that, that's a little bit more involved. So we first want to outline this method. And then we want to say, right, if there's an auth header, which will look like this header will eventually be in our fetch request on the front end. If there's an auth header, right? If there is, basically that's what we're saying on that line is if there is something to encode or decode, and we can grab that header using the authorization key. Make sure I'm spelling authorization right. Authorization, okay, that looks right. Right, so what this line is saying, if there is an auth header place, if there is something to decode that is getting sent in our fetch request, right? Then I am going to take that token, actually kind of like get it in a format where I can read it. And all this is doing is my JavaScript header is eventually going to look like this. It's going to have bearer token as kind of the format of how we're going to pass this token to our backend. And what I'm doing here is saying, okay, look at the authorization key, right? I'm going to look at that. I'm going to get bearer token back. And then I want to split it at the space, which is what I'm doing here. I don't want this 0 argument, right? Split's going to give me an array. I don't want 0. I want the actual token, right? And that's what I will ultimately be saving as my token. And then I am going to use this begin kind of rescue syntax here, which we'll talk a little bit about, but didn't want that, which we'll talk a little bit about after I type this out. But essentially, we don't want our code to fall apart if this token wasn't able to be decoded. We want to be able to just return a nil. So again, decode takes in 3 arguments as well. It takes in the JWT token as a string, which we've encoded up above in here. It then takes our application secret. And again, optionally, our hashing algorithm, which Anthony just asked about. We're using HS256. And again, we're using the same secret from up above. To repeat, we definitely want that in our environment variables. And then we're going to pass in the algorithm. And it is our HS256. Cool. So
not to pick, but this my secret up above is not the same as my secret down below. There's instead of an E up there, there's a 3 down here.
Honestly, Connie, if we did not have you today.
And decode, you have 2 E's, and I just hate to only be talking about typos. It's stupid. But
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Thank you so much. No, please do not apologize. We would have been wasting 10 minutes trying to figure out and go back to all of this stuff. So Connie, you are the hero of this study group. So, okay, so rescue. Luckily, we have decode errors, right? Which JWT will also return, right? So if we get an error, we're gonna rescue that error, return nil, so that our application doesn't just kind of like.
You don't need the begin as part of a def. The begin can be assumed. You can move the rescue error, the rescue to the same line as the diff if you want.
Okay, we can try that out later, but this is the way we're gonna build it out. For now, I don't know why I don't need this extra in. Yeah, cool. So this is the way I typically build it out. We can try kind of your syntax flow as well once we get this tested. But just to review, right? In the header of our fetch request, we're eventually going to be passing something with the key authorization value bearer with our JWT token that we have encoded here. Every user is going to get an encoded token at sign up, right? So once we have that, once they have an encoded token, we can make fetch requests to our backend to decode that token using that auth header that we'll eventually get back. And we'll again use JWT, that decode method here, pass in those those arguments. I'm trying to remember why. I always use true here, but I'm trying to remember why, and I'll make sure I make a note like I always do in our study groups as to like, you know, why. Let's circle back on this thing that came up. But I have my arguments here. I'm passing in the token, passing in the secret, passing in the algorithm. This is optional. Anyone have any questions about this JWT setup so far before we move on to our helpers? Because our helpers are really just going to leverage those JWT methods we built out above. So we're kind of just going to be building on top of this. And before we build on top of it, I want to make sure we feel comfortable with it. And again, this is talked a little bit more about in this walkthrough. Here is what it looks like to encode a JWT token. This is the payload. This is what gets encoded when we call JWT encode. And then if we want to decode it, return something like this. And we're able to get back that payload through decoding that token. And this walkthrough also gives some more comments on what that looks like. Right, so that fetch request on the front end may look like something like this with our bearer token. This is what we're going to be leveraging here to actually decode that token.
And this doesn't live in a cookie. This will live in a variable inside of the JSON.
Yes, yes, that's exactly right. We're going to get a key back that says JWT, and it's going to have that token. And once we get to the front end, there's going to be a caveat about all of the different like security trade-offs there are with JWT and tokens, because there definitely are trade-offs. And there are folks that use the cookie as well to implement this. And I have some links down below in this walkthrough that we'll review. Good question. Any other questions, y'all, before we move on to the helpers, right? Our current user helper, our logged in helper, and then our authorized, our authorization. Cool. All right, so now we're gonna start our helper methods. The first one, which if you've built out your Rails project or even your Sinatra project, you probably used current user. And in here, we're going to say, right, like if we were able to properly decode that token, right, if we're not getting a nil, then in here, I want to look at the user ID or create a variable called user ID, decode that token. I'm going to use all of these variables I've written before just so you don't have any typos here, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to decode the token. Let's actually look at what this returns. And we're gonna put a buy bug in here in case folks have questions. But again, this is what JWT decode returns. So we're gonna get an array. First going to get this object, then we're gonna get the algorithm object. Us putting 0 next to like decode return or what decode returns is going to give us just that payload. In our case, payload is we're going to have the user ID be the key on our payload. In this example, beef, for whatever reason, is the payload. I guess beefsteak is just for an example. But in our example, user ID is going to be the key and the value is going to be what we actually want. So that's what we're storing into a variable here. And then we're going to use that user ID to find our user. So this part should feel like review, right? We're just using our active record. I can't type today. Find methods here. And find by needs a key value pair. And we're going to give that to it here. And then we need another n. So that is going to be our current user helper method. I may just use these comments so folks can see kind of like, so just a refresher of what is actually happening here, right? So in our case, it's going to be user ID, right, is 1. And that getting the 0 for that array is just going to get us that payload, which is what we want here. Anyone have any questions about this current user helper method? Once we get this up and running, we can pop buy bugs everywhere and see how all of this is working. That's how I ended up getting a better idea of the JWT flow, because payloads and the decode method and the encode method, it can be kind of confusing what they actually return and what they actually give us. But putting debuggers in everywhere, not debuggers, but buy bugs or binding that prize in everywhere kind of lets us see what's happening under the hood. So this is our current user helper method. We're also going to build out, right, this logged in method, which I'm just going to copy and paste because this is pretty straightforward. And this is probably something we have seen and done a couple of times already. Make sure my indentation is correct. And right, so we're going to make sure our logged in returns a Boolean, right? Current user is going to return the truthy value of a found user, a truthy value, but we want it to return true or false. That's what this double bang operator is going to do for us. Last step is our authorization helper method. So what this is ultimately going to do for us, this is not indented properly. Make sure I'm doing toggle soft wrap here. Cool. So what this is going to do for us is allow us to lock down our application. So if a user is not authorized to see something, right, or do something, they're not able to do it through this helper method. We built something similar to this. If you've seen my Sinatra project build, are you authorized to edit? And we pass in an individual object, for example, to check that authorization. Here, we're basically saying, right, if you're not logged in, you're not authorized to do anything, right? So we want to make sure that you log in before you do that. And we show you this message. We return this JSON instead of actually returning anything truthy or any data. Our last step, y'all, for implementing JWT, I'll delete this for now since y'all can see these notes in the walkthrough. Last thing you want to do is go ahead and implement a before action, which is basically which is basically going to lock down our entire application, right? So we will call the authorized method before anything else happens in our app. This will effectively lock down the entire application. Now there is places like in our auth controller where we're going to skip before action. For example, when the user is trying to create themselves, we don't want them to have to be authorized to create themselves. They'll never be able to ever get authorized. But for everything else, for now, we're saying we want to make sure you're authorized before you can do anything in our application. That includes create a syllabus, for example. Anyone have any questions about anything that we just talked about before we actually update our user controller and test this out? I want to make sure that we are answering any questions. That's why I also extended this to 12:30 because I know JWT can be a little tricky.
And I have a question. This is in our application controller. And so if we were to access like another controller and it's inherited from the application controller, do these methods automatically run or do we have to call them?
We do have to call them. So that is what is in our kind of step 2 of this walkthrough. Next step we're going to do is we're going to update our create method in our user controller, which is going to call our encode token method to give that user a token. So we do have to actually call these methods in order to do things like encode the token, for example.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
Great question. Right, like can we just write these methods and it work? I wish. Okay, so now that we have bcrypt built out, JWT and bcrypt built out, we're going to update our create method to actually take advantage of that JWT functionality we just built out here. We're going to encode that token, and we are going to give it the payload of user ID. So remember, right, once our user is created and they're valid, we are going to use our encode token method in our application controller. We get access to that method because we're inheriting from application controller here. And we're passing in a payload. Passing encode. We remember the way this is built out. It needs a payload as its argument. It has our secret. It's using HS256 is by default, but we need to give it that payload, which is what we're doing on line 8 here. Once we have successfully given that, we've successfully encoded that token, then we want to not only pass back this user, this serialized data for the user, we also want to pass some other data, right? This is what Anthony was just asking about, right? Like, how are we passing this token? What is it going to look like in our JSON? Is it just going to be JWT? Yep, it's going to be a JWT key that is in the JSON that gets passed back, and we're passing back the actual token that gets encoded. Remember, the token's going to look something like this JWT string here. So this is what we needed to do in order to actually kind of update our application to be leveraging JWT. And again, we can test this in Postman, but there's one thing we want to make sure we do. There's one last thing we need to do to be able to test this in Postman. What are we forgetting?
Logout, the ability to revoke the token?
Not yet. So that's exactly what you eventually want to like strengthen this up, beat this up a little bit more, implement login, and also some sort of like a better message that gets sent back if we weren't able to encode the token properly. But remember what I said about our authorization method? This method is locking down our entire application, which means the user will not be able to access any functionality in our application if they are not authorized, if they are not logged in.
So
right?
skip before action, which is great.
Yes, 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 yes. So I'm pretty sure if y'all have implemented auth before, there's probably you've probably used skip before action somewhere. But we only want to do it for create, right? Because just as we mentioned earlier, right, you can't be authorized if you're not a user yet, right? So we're going to be nice to you. We'll let you in this one time just to create. And when we say skip before action, we specifically mean skip this before action, this authorized method.
You may also need to implement a skip if authorized. So if you're on, for instance, a sign-up page, if a person's already authorized and they try to travel to the sign-up page, they should be kicked back to the home page, because that's what GitHub does. That's what Facebook does. A couple of sites we tried to navigate their sign-up page, they kick you back to the home page.
Yeah, so if they are authorized, we're just going to use this, if we're going to use this current user helper method. So I'm trying to think of when we would need a skip if authorized method, because this
on the sign up page, if a person is authorized, they shouldn't be able to reach the sign up page.
Right. Okay. So yes, that's the front end. And we can there's definitely some logic we can do on the front end that says, right, if you have a token, right, you're already authorized. We don't need you to reauthorize yourself. And we're going to be passing that authorization bearer token with every single fetch request, right? That's going to make sure our user is authorized here. That's all. What ultimately is going to happen is every time we send back that our fetch request with our authorization bearer token. Gonna hit auth headers. That's going to decode that token, and that's going to let the user into our application. It's going to authorize them essentially. I got some good questions. Any other questions before we move forward? Because our very, very next step is we want to test with Postman. Right? We've now implemented JWT, updated our create action to actually give the user a token upon creation. So let's go ahead and test this out. So did I create any other data? No. All right, so let's just use Sylvia again, but instead of Sylvia Woods, we're just going to do Sylvia at Sylvia Woods. And we're going to probably drop our database after this. So there won't be 3,000 Sylvias in there. But pre-JWT, this is the JSON data that got returned. I believe Chris also asked the question, right? Is JWT nesting this that much? No, we are, because we are sending back serialized data. Our data gets serialized and is stored in this data object here. But then also in our render, we're also nesting it under user as well. Cool. So this is our JSON response pre-JWT. Let's go ahead and hit send, right? Same headers, same body, same post request, same user endpoint. Oh, right. Syntax error. Not surprising. It's at our before action. Get that syntax wrong. Oh, okay, we're missing a colon here. All right, so what was happening was I was missing a colon at where my only is. So, and that's kind of what I've deduced from this error right here. Line 2, user controller. Cool. See, yeah, we not had Connie's super eyes earlier. We would have been doing a lot more of that. So let's go ahead and press send. What is this error? Another syntax error. JWT. All right, this one.
Are you supposed to do 2 colons instead of 1?
Ah, yes, I think that's exactly it, Anthony. I think I need 2 colons here. Let's see. Yeah, that looks about right. Let me just double check. Yep, that's exactly right. Y'all got some good eyes. Okay, cool. So let me try this again. And I probably, do I need to restart my server? I shouldn't. Decode, still getting that same error.
Save it.
Did I save it? That's an excellent question. And I did not. What would I do without y'all? All right, send it. Is there a buy bug somewhere? Let's see. No, it's just taking a while. Started the post. It shouldn't take that long. I'm gonna quit the server. Uh-oh, if I can. All right, let's cancel this request. Quit the server, and let's try it again. Terminate that. All right, and let's do Rails S again. Okay. I got this.
Run bundle exec Rails.
No, I have to use a different, I think it's 2. Yeah, I have some RVM issues I need to sort out. All right, server's already running, fine. quit whatever is running in the background. Alrighty. Let's try this again. Okay. Let's see what happens now. This data looks correct. We only changed Sylvia at sylvia.com. And then in our code, it is saved. There's no buy bugs anywhere. Make sure there's no buy bugs in our code over here. Cool. All right, let's try this again. There we are. So we have that JSON response, but look what we also have now. We also have our like 3 period separated, or 3 period separated 1, 2, or 3 strings separated by periods, JWT encoded token that we passed right back along with the rest of our JSON data from our user here on this line. So our JWT is working, and so is our create method for creating a user.
Why are you responding back with the same user data that was submitted?
What do you mean?
So we're responding back when you send them a request and you send all the body information, right? Bio and everything. Why are you responding back that the user's been created with the same bio information? Instead of just handing them a JWT token.
You said what?
Instead of just handing the user back the JWT token, you're handing back the whole user.
Right. So this is what happens at sign up, right? So when we make a post request to our create method in our front end, when that user is created, let's say right after they're created, not only do we want to store their JWT token in local storage, but we also want to show them their name, show them their profile, right? Show them some sort of data
Yeah, but that data should already be on their server because they're on the local host because they're the one who provided it. So you're sending more data back than needed, which can lead to.
So we also don't want to render. So the way you're speaking of is we can do optimistic rendering, right? Where we get the data from, let's say, their inputs, and I'm assuming that's what you mean. Like we already have their name and email and bio from them putting it in our form. We could just display that to them as well, right? But that would be optimistic rendering. We don't want to display any data before they've actually successfully been created. And we know that that's happened because we're getting this response and not this response here.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and there's different ways we can do this. And y'all will see JavaScript is kind of, you can make your own rules there. So there's a couple ways we can handle manipulating the DOM in our response. This is one of the ways we're going to do it. We're going to get that data and show it to them eventually. But we tested it out, and we now have a token. And we're issuing the token in our user controller create for right now. But we also want to issue the token in the auth controller create. Anyone have any hypotheses or what may be happening in our auth controller create method?
You're checking for existing users. If they have the password, then you give them the token back.
That's exactly right. So we're going to log the user in auth create. And I'm going to minimize this Postman window for now. And just as we have it stated in this walkthrough, step 3, we're now on. Right, so step 1 was encoding and decoding the JWT token, kind of building out that functionality. Step 2 is updating the user's controller to actually encode and give the user pass back that token in our JSON response and test it out using Postman. Now, step 3 is going to be implementing login on the front end. And in order to do that, we are first going to need to create an auth controller. And remember, our controllers and our routes and everything are namespaced. So that is how I need to generate my controller. I'm gonna press enter here. Ah, gosh, I need to fix my RVM issues. All right. RVM use 2.6. All right. Sweet. So that's going to generate a controller for me. And I now see that controller here, and it is namespaced properly. Everything's looking so far so good. Again, just like in my users controller, I am going to skip that before action of authorize, because what they're trying to do, right, if they hit my create method, is authorize themselves. They're trying to get permission. So I'm going to allow them to skip that, and I'm going to actually start building out this create. All right, so there's a couple of things I need to do here. As Anthony mentioned, right, I need to like first find the user. And this should be super familiar from Rails, right? This is kind of how both Rails and Sinatra kind of requires us to use bcrypt and authenticate our user. So in our case, we're going to find the user by their email. But what's different in this case is we are not using our user params. We're using our user login params. So I'm going to drop these strong params in here. And as we can see, right, the only thing that we're going to pass to this controller is email and password, right? Because once we get in our front end, I'm just gonna make this a little smaller, sorry. We're only gonna ask for their email and their password. So that's all we're gonna be sending back to this controller. So that's all our strong params need. We're requiring user just like before, and we're permitting these attributes. So for example, if Missy Elliott were to sign up for our application, this is going to be her email, and her password is going to be misdemeanor. So that's what that's going to look like. And in order to actually get access to that email, I'm going to dip into those params. All right, this next step, right? Same thing. If the user is found, only then am I interested in getting the opportunity to authenticate them. Can anyone give us a kind of a refresher on what this authenticate method is doing, and kind of how we get access to it? What is .authenticate doing for us? I'm gonna give us a refresher on this. If you are in the Rails section, you should definitely try, because this is a question I asked in the project review. .authenticate is coming from bcrypt, right? This is not a JWT method. We get .authenticate from this has secure password macro in our model. This walkthrough gives a very, very thorough explanation of what's actually happening here.
.authenticate is not coming from bcrypt. It's a wrapper around a bcrypt hashing algorithm.
But if we don't have bcrypt, we don't have access to hash secure password.
We don't, but
yeah. So semantics, but if it's we're allowed to use hash secure password because of our bcrypt gem. And somewhere in here, they talk about yeah, this .authenticate method. So if we were to build our own authenticate method, it may look something like this, where we have, right, we're using bcrypt and we're spinning up a new password, passing in that password digest, that digested password, and we're basically comparing it against the plain text password. So what we're doing in here, something in my throat. Where are we? Auth controller. What we're doing in here is we're using .authenticate, which we're able to get from the hash secure password macro, which we're able to leverage because we have our bcrypt gem. What this .authenticate method is doing is saying, okay, I need the plain text password. I need to know what the user typed in. I need to know what the user typed in. And the reason we're calling this method on an instance of our user, because in our database is the password digest attribute, right? So it's going to compare the plain text password with bcrypt's hash password. And if those check out, those are correct, then we are in good shape to, right, encode the token, to give the user a token because they are who they say they are and we trust them now. So again, I'm going to use that encode token method and I'm going to pass in, again, this payload. Just like in my user controller. And same thing, right? I'm going to render this JSON, the user object, and their token right along with it. Else, you are not allowed. You are unauthorized. So here, the flow is a little different because we're finding the user first. The user's already been created. We're not creating anyone. And then we're saying, okay, if this is confirmed, if we found them, we're going to authenticate them. Awesome. If they're authenticated, we're going to give them a token. This is what's actually logging the user in. Similar to how, although JWT is very different than session, but similar to how once the user was authenticated, we give them a session or a key value pair in their session. Here, we're giving them a token, a JWT token, and we're returning that token to our front end. And now that we've built this out, right, we, of course, want to build a route. We built this controller, but we haven't built a route for it yet. And we can build a custom route. We're going to say if we post to /login, so for in our case, API v1 /login, we're going to route it to this create method. And just a quick note, right? Just like we have here, the user data can be stored in our application server, our backend, our API, while the token is stored client side. So this token is what we're actually going to store to keep track of the user throughout the application. But let me go to my routes and move this thing down just so I can see all my folders, all my files. So now we have this new route because we have this new controller and this new method. Before we go to test this out using Postman again, does anyone have any questions about why an auth controller, right? Why this flow, this logical flow? There is a world in which we totally could have made a def login method in our user's controller. But in the future, we may have some more auth functionality we want to build out, and it makes sense to kind of separate that functionality out. All right, y'all. Moment of truth. Let's make sure our server is running. Yes. Cool. All right. So because I am posting to a different route, I need to do this /login route, right? This route I just created instead of users, what we were testing before. It's still a post method. But the body is different, right? This is a user we should already have in our database. So this body is going to look a little different, right? We are only passing in, we're only giving email and password, right? So in testing this with Postman, this is what the body is going to look like, only email and password. Go ahead, test this out. Header is still the same. Same thing, we were able to retrieve that Sylvia object, that user, ID 3, and here is their JWT token. So we are in a critical point in our implementation where now any fetch request that we make to our backend, whether it's not any, but whether it's a post to create the user or a post to the login route to authenticate the user, we're giving our front end, our JavaScript front end, a JWT token with both calls. This is a huge win for us, and we could honestly stop right here, but I really, really wanted to talk about how we would actually use that token in the front end, right? A lot of walkthroughs talk about how you would implement JWT in the back end, but kind of leave the front end out of it, or they talk about how to implement JWT with the Rails backend and a React or Angular front end. So let's talk about how we would do this with like just a vanilla JavaScript front end. And again, like I mentioned, there are some disclaimers. There are trade-offs to storing JWT in our local storage. I have linked this really, really good article about all of the like this. It goes in depth, and he talks about JWT cookie storage versus JWT local storage somewhere. And then goes into the difference, session storage or local storage security. The key here is just make sure we're always sending these requests over HTTPS securely, not just HTTP. JWT cookie storage is actually more secure, but we haven't really gone over that anywhere in the curriculum, and it's not as familiar. So we're going to be using local storage, but this walkthrough goes through kind of like how it would look, how this implementation could look both ways. And then also there's another resource I have in here, this Stack Overflow post that talks a little bit more about these different trade-offs as well. Too long, don't read. Just make sure, secure your application further. We should set our tokens to expire always, and we should make sure our app is being served over HTTPS. And please do read this, y'all, because this is some good stuff. There's some good nuggets in here. Auth is a huge topic, and there's many, many ways to do it.
Can we put the service worker? I've been reading that there's a way to, what's the word? Isolate certain data within your application by putting it inside a service worker, which does not share access with the window. So if we put if we used a service worker proxy, which I've been doing a little reading about. Well, that's what they talk about in the job, at least. Service worker proxy as a mechanism to keep the thing. Are you still susceptible? Damn these words. Are you still susceptible to cross-site scripting attack?
Yeah, that's a good question. I need to look at an implementation of that, because if we're still storing the token on the front end using, like, because we can have a service worker on the back end, right? And that would.
Well, service workers are how you do multiple executions for your JavaScript. So I don't know about any service workers in the back end. That would be.
Oh, okay. So, okay, I thought you meant service worker just like as a module. But service worker on the front, I would have to see that implementation and also do more research on the security benefits of service workers in general. But I know, right, there's some cross-reference attacks that we can be susceptible to. But definitely, so we have I think you're already in it. We have a JS project build Slack channel. If you find more information on this, please put it there, because then I can just wrap that into this study group and we can include that conversation as well. Excellent points here, y'all. All right. So we were in the back end this whole entire time. Now let's talk about the front end, and we got about 5 minutes left. We are most likely going to go over. Again, this is probably one of those study groups that need to be broken up into 2 parts, like a back end and a front end part. But if you actually have a hard stop at 12:30, just an overview of what it is we're going to be talking about. And of course, this is also recorded. We're going to create a login form on the front end, which I've already done. We're going to create an event listener and handler for that login form. We are going to make a post fetch request to that login form, right? Using this route that we just built out. The body is going to look like what exactly we have in our Postman body. And then step 4 is we are going to store the token in local storage. Again, this is where those trade-offs that we were just talking about come into play. So do that research. But for now, we're going to store it in local storage using local storage.setItem. I've also linked to local storage documentation here as well. And in here, it talks about the different methods we can call on local storage. So we are going to store our JWT token in local storage using the setItem method. We're going to do that in our JSON response, right? So this is why in Postman, it's very, very helpful. Like this is kind of the whole point, is to send that data back in that response so we can then keep track of that token on our front end. If we want to go a step further, right, we can then show the user their data using local storage get item. So here we set it with the key of JWT token, and we give it that token, right? Our JSON response is JSON. In that response is a JWT key, as we can see in Postman here. But, right, let's say we want to have a user profile functionality. We can also have like a render user profile function, and we can make a fetch request to backslash profile. This is where those headers come in, right? This authorization, bearer token headers come in. We can see that here. Where are we? I'm on my application controller. Right, so remember this auth header method. This is how this is kind of what that is speaking to. As a part of the fetch request to get data from my user, right? I'm going to send back an authorization header. I'm also going to send an authorization header in my post request for a syllabus, right? If you want to post something, right? Because I have this authorized before action, I need to send a token with every fetch request from here on out. And the way I do that, the way I send that token to my backend to authorize the user is, again, send an authorization header. It's going to have the word bearer in it, but then also, kind of more importantly, it's going to have that token. I'm going to get that JWT token. And for example, just to test it, we can send do an alert that says welcome back. And this is where we talked about that extreme nesting that's now happening. But we go into that JSON object, then we go into the user object, into the data, then the attributes. And this is how we would implement JWT on the front end. If you're going to implement something like a user profile functionality, we of course would need to build out a profile method that is going to render some JSON. And we need to, of course, build out that profile route in our backend as well here. So let me think about this. I guess we can go through, we'll use the next 10 to 15 minutes to go through actually building out the login form functionality, and I'll let y'all implement the profile functionality because all the code's here. And I really do think like getting practice with, I'm scrolling, but I'm losing where I am. getting practice with sending that. I wish we had some time to go over what sending that authorization header looks like. In the future, when I give this study group, I'll just break it up into 2 parts. But for folks who have to leave at 12:30, that's the front end piece. We've done all the back end work, and these 5 steps is kind of like the front end piece here. But for folks who can hang around for 10, 15 more minutes, let's go ahead and just implement login. So again, this is a mantra you have heard me repeat over and over again. I got it from my Flatiron School instructor and in DC. When some event happens, right, I want to make what kind of fetch and manipulate the DOM in what way. This is the question, the series of questions I ask myself whenever I'm implementing a new functionality, new feature in JavaScript. So in this case, for my login to work on my front end, the answer to that is when a submit event happens, I want to make a post fetch request to my login route, and I want to render a welcome message. So in order to do that, I'm going to essentially establish a login. We're kind of done with the backend, y'all, because we tested all this with Postman and we know it's working. And I also already have a form in place here. So I already have my login form, which y'all can see here. Again, we built all this out from our Bootstrap study group last week, or the week before last. So my login form's in place. So kind of step 1 here is in place for me. I also am giving that form an ID so that in step 2, when I go to create an event listener and handler for that form, I can grab it on my DOM. So in my JavaScript code, I'm going to come here. I'm going to toggle soft wrap again. Like very, I can kind of borrow a lot of this code, which I will do. So this for me would be, right, login form. Get rid of some of this space here. And instead of create syllabus form, right, my ID is login form. And then again, I would use login form here. Let's name this, let's name this login form handler. I could have changed all of these at one time, but so what's happening now is, and then what is this ending? This is my DOM content loaded. So in DOM content loaded, when the DOM loads, I'm querying for my login form. I am then listening for a submit event of that login form. And I'm also going to handle, right, that I'm going to handle what we get back from there. So I'm going to actually build out my form handler here. And I'm not in a class, so I need that function keyword. Cool. In here, I'm just going to start by logging my event. Whenever I create an event listener and a handler, I just log my event to make sure that things are set up properly. And what do I need to do with the event before I can log it? Before I can actually see that, before I can actually see the event in the console, what do I need to do on line 31? What is the default action of a form in JavaScript?
Let's submit and then it refreshes. You need to prevent default.
Exactly. I'm trying to move my Zoom windows around. But yeah, I need to prevent the default behavior of my submit event. Save that. Let's refresh the page here. Okay. Why am I getting this error from line 17? Why is it not letting me fetch to my syllabus? My syllabus is endpoint. Let's pull up my syllabus.
Is it a CORS issue?
So not a CORS issue. That's a good, it says unauthorized. it was a CORS issue, it would say something about CORS, something about cross-reference origin or something like that, right? But why am I getting a 401 unauthorized error from my syllabus controller? Because I need to skip something. I need to skip something for right now. That's exactly right. For right now, I'm just going to skip the before action. In the, what's the syntax? Eventually, I do want to build it out so that, I'm just going to skip what before action for, let's do just index. Eventually, I want to build this out so that, right, when they create, I'm sending some authorization header. But for right now, I don't really care if users see the syllabi if they're not logged in. They can see it, they just can't create it. So I'm going to skip the before action only for authorized. I'm going to refresh that page and that error goes away and I get my syllabus. Cool.
What's it mean you broke a promise?
You said what?
Broke a promise?
What?
Second line.
Second line?
No, it's gone now. In the error console, it said you promise. Are you doing async promises that are not going through? Never mind.
No, there was two errors. There was the unauthorized error and there was a for each error. I got the for each error probably because I actually didn't get this data back. I'm assuming, and we can actually double check. Yeah, so can I read property for each of undefined? That is on line 20. Yeah, which is basically because there was no JSON response, because the user wasn't authorized to see the syllabus. That's why I was getting that error. Cool. All right. So, did you say something, Anthony?
Thank you.
Oh, okay. You're welcome. You're welcome. All right. So now the user can see the syllabi, all is well. We only have one for now. We can add this later. But what we really care about testing out is our login functionality. And for right now, right, we're just, for right now, we're just preventing the default behavior, but because I didn't pass E in, that the default behavior didn't get stopped. So let's refresh the page again. Let's again try to just log the event. The event is logged, so we know we are on the right track here. So now, in the interest of time, I am just going to copy and paste some stuff. When y'all build this out, I definitely recommend building it out. That's not what I wanted to do. Definitely recommend building it out yourselves and kind of doing what makes sense for you here. But what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the e.target. In my case, because I'm listening for the login form, my target is the form. I am then chaining a query selector onto my form to look for the login email input, which is right here, right? ID login email. Same thing for password. I'm grabbing those values and then I'm invoking another function called login fetch here, which I will declare. There we go. That's what I wanted. And I'm going to pass in the email and the password here. Remember, these do not have to be the exact same spelling or variables, but they do need to be the exact same order. All right, once the form handler gets triggered, it triggers my fetch request. My fetch request is going to look a little something like this. I am going to start by assembling my body data outside of the fetch request. Remember, we're using strong params for a user, so I have to nest it like my body object has to have a nested user object where I'm passing the email and the password. Remember, we talked about JavaScript destructuring in our previous study group. Because these two keys match, I can just do this. This will work as well. Which is why I like to pass my arguments as whatever keys are in my database, right? So if we look at my Postman, my login, right, in my database, right, it's email, password, the params are email, password. What I need to send back is email, password in my body. And because email and password are the exact same words, like I don't need to put them on both sides. JavaScript destructuring allows us to do that. And I can, there's some documentation and I believe part 4 or part 3, and I can resend that documentation for folks that have questions about this. But here I'm using destructuring, which comes in handy, especially if this becomes like a longer body. And I am again, right, sending a fetch request to this login route, right? I'm using my post method, my header, content type, my body is that body data. Again, right after I get all that, I'm gonna call .then on that promise. Get that response, parse that response to JSON, and then I'm going to actually kind of call another .then on that promise that gets returned, and call .json on that. And for now, I'm just gonna log it. Just gonna log that JSON data. So I'm a user in the database. If I go to users here, there's no users route. Let's go ahead and is my server running? Oh, there actually is not a users route. You are correct, Rails. My apologies. Okay, I'm not, so I know I'm in the database. I forgot I need to set my user controller up. I didn't do that. But I am in the database as Ayana at ayana.com. I could also just look at my seeds file. And my password is PW. So that's what I'm going to log in as. So I'm going to do email, PW. I'm going to hit my submit button and look at that. What happens is I am console logging the JSON and I see that JSON data, right? With that, I should have removed this syllabus console log. But if y'all can see, I'm gonna make this a little bigger. This is what my user object looks like, right? I have this user object which has my attributes in here, but at the top level, I have my JWT token, which I am passing through. So we did it, right? Like this is exactly what we wanted to happen. And eventually, right, what I ultimately want to do is actually do local storage to set that item. And I'm going to give it the key of JWT token. I could name this whatever I want, but I'm going to name it JWT token. And because I see that this token is being stored kind of at the top level of this response. So it's like when console logging JSON, we have JWT and we have user. I can just do JSON here and then do JWT because I'm getting this key right here. And then, as we mentioned, we may do a render, but for now, I'm just going to create a render user profile function just to show y'all how we would then get that token. And then we are going to call it a day because we are going on 2 hours here. All right, so in here, I just want to log local storage. I'm going to actually get my item, and the item I want to get is JWT token. All right. I'm going to refresh this page. I'm going to log in with those same credentials we know just worked. And I get that token back. This is the exact same token you saw in our serialized data in our postman. And let's say if I were to, we have some error handling here. Okay, yeah, so it's undefined because basically you're unauthorized. If we were to go to our network tab and check this out, invalid email or password. So we could then render that message as well. So y'all, we went through a lot today. In the future, as with most of these project build videos we've been doing lately, I'm noticing some of these need to be broken up into 2 parts because it's a lot of information. But I do want to open it up for questions about the front end in case folks have any. I know we're 30 minutes over, but I do want to make sure we answer questions while we have each other here.
Ayana, for your when you did the post index and you did the skip before action, if I wanted
Post
to
before action, where?
Didn't you skip the before action for authorized in the post?
Well, no, in the syllabus controller.
Oh, right, in the syllabus controller. If we wanted to, I guess, not skip it, what we call like before action current user to make sure that user is logged in throughout our application and using our application.
So what you can use throughout the application, you don't have to, so that's the beauty of like storing, like authorizing the user getting that token and just using that token throughout the application. Because then what you can do is if you want to make any other fetch request, you just then use that token, right? So let's say you want to, I know you had a game, if you want to get their most recent games, you can use that token in your request to get their games. Or if for example, if you wanted them to create a game, the get the games was a bad example because they can get their games as, you know, whenever they log in. But if you want to have authorization to actually create a game, you can just make sure that they have the token, but also you're talking about keeping track of who is actually logged in?
More of, so we add it in the header, and then when we hit, I guess, the post fetch request,
Yeah.
It goes to, I guess in my case, it would be the games controller. Wouldn't it still need some sort of, because I know my issue was, it was like running into, like the you're not logged in kind of thing, even though I had the local storage set with the token. And it was like, so do I have to call a method in order to decode that token before it can hit the rest of that specific, I guess, the create route of my games controller?
So
it's like when you were in your syllabus index and it was saying that you were not logged in, and so you just kind of like skipped over it with the skip before action. So should we just go ahead and just skip before action for all the rest of our controllers then? Does that make sense?
No,
because
you definitely don't want to, you want to authorize the user. So I want to make sure I'm understanding your question correct.
Like just for like example, if you hadn't put the skip before action in showing your index for your syllabus, and let's say we wanted to actually authorize, like you couldn't view all the syllabus unless you were, I don't know, a current user, then how would you do that? How would you get past that error?
So I would have to send the fetch request with this authorization bearer token.
And then it would just, I guess,
And
I don't want to use the word automatically run, but like automatically decode and all that stuff.
Oh, okay. I get your question now. So what me sending this token will do is, and then this is when our current user helper method comes in, because our current user helper method is decoding the token.
Okay.
So when we send this back in whatever controller, like basically, so in here, I would have to do if current user or something like that. I would have to call current user.
Okay.
Right. And then that would give me access to, like, I would have to decode my token and
right.
do other. It depends on what you're trying to do. Maybe you just need to decode the token, or maybe you need to call current user.
Okay. So we have to call current user inside the method.
Yeah.
The route.
Yeah, you want to decode the token at some point, right? Because that is how the user is actually going to get themselves authorized.
Okay.
Right, because
that was my question, I think.
Yeah, and in this authorized method, we're using logged in. Logged in is using our current user method, which is decoding our token. So this is a really, really good question. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do like a part 2 to this and actually build out creating the syllabus with a logged in user versus trying to do it without a logged in user and seeing how those flows are different.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Tam. Yeah, I'll make sure I include that in the next group. But we would want to leverage this current user method that is decoding our token.
Okay, thank you, Ayan.
Of course. Any other questions, y'all, before we head out? It was a super long one. So for the folks who are still with us, thank you for hanging with us. And as always, let me close out some of this stuff. As always, I am going to post